Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this edition or our 3 for 3 pop-up fair, where we will be talking about immigration as part of our recognition and celebration of tomorrow being National Immigrants Day. But before we get started, I do want to make sure that we acknowledge the land that we currently operate on. And the University of Nevada, Las Vegas wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and recognize that the university is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuivi Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunities to study, learn, and work in a community with this land. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in continued learning about the indigenous peoples who work and live on this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Myopi Band of Paiutes, and about the historical and present realities of colonialism. As one of the most diverse institutions in the United States, UNLV believes it is important to recognize and appreciate the use of Southern Paiute land as part of its mission to be a welcoming and inclusive place for working and learning. Again, welcome, everyone. Proclaimed by President Ronald Reagan in 1987, October 28th was designated as National Immigrants Day. That day, October 28th, 1987, marked the 101st anniversary of the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty, described by the renowned author and activist Emma Lazarus as the mother of exiles, from whose beckoned hand glows worldwide welcome. That proclamation further states our national celebration of Immigrants Day is a moving reminder to us that America is unique among the nations. We are the sons and daughters of every land across the face of the earth. Yet we are an indivisible nation. We are one people, and we are one in that which drew our forefathers here, the love of freedom's holy light. I thought that that was an important quote to begin with this morning or this afternoon, because it frames why we acknowledge this day tomorrow as Immigrants Day. But one of the things that I thought about in reading that is the contradictions of hearing that, and particularly what we potentially may be seeing today on any given day when we're looking on the news, reading a newspaper, and that. And so I am hopeful that during this conversation that we have today, that we can maybe figure out ways in which to come full circle to celebrate immigrants, and because we all are immigrants in one way or the other, and that coupled with recognizing that our first Americans, certainly are part of this whole legacy. So I want to once again thank everyone for being here this morning, and I am extremely excited to be part of this discussion or try to lead it in some kind of a way, but obviously letting our experts talk. So today we are joined by Ms. Nayeli Rico Lopez, who is the Undocumented Student Program Resource Coordinator, Dr. Amy Reed Sandoval, who's an assistant professor of philosophy and author of Socially Undocumented, and Michael Kagan, who is the director of the Immigration Clinic. Welcome all. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon for this all important conversation, and as part of our activities that we're having for I Stand With Immigrants, which we'll be celebrating tomorrow. So What I'd like to just kind of start off as baseline here is to get information from each of you about what you do in this space as we relate to immigration, whether that is your professional work or your research and teaching. And so I really like to start with Nayeli, since she is the newest person here at UNLV, just joining us in this role. So I'll start with Nayeli. So tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Nayeli Rico Lopez. I am the undocumented resource coordinator for the undocumented student program here at UNLV. I just joined UNLV this past September, so slowly getting the ball rolling on many of our programming and events and initiatives. But part of is what is part of my job is basically to provide support for our undocumented student population, whether that be through finding scholarships and financial aid or directing them to different services on campus or resources, kind of just helping them navigate college as an undocumented student. And seeing what challenges we have and how to tackle those challenges when the students come across them. So basically just here as a support system for our students. I am also a DACA recipient myself, so a lot of the information that we'll be talking about today, and basically the work that I do is super personal to me, and I am super passionate about it. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation today. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Natalie. Michael, tell us about what you do, particularly with the Immigration Center.
Sure. So I'm the director of the UNLV Immigration Clinic. I'm also a law professor, and I teach. So I teach immigration law, but also practice. And especially in the law since 2014, the Immigration Clinic has expanded a lot, and we're in the midst of our most significant expansion right now. For those who aren't familiar, clinics at law schools are kind of like teaching hospitals for medical students, except for lawyers. So law students, under supervision from a faculty member like myself, practice law. You typically in their third year, their last year of law school, and in the process, provide free services to the public. But our clinic, which has existed long before I came to UNLV, has grown a lot in response to various immigration crises that have happened since 2014, starting with the influx of kids fleeing violence in Central America. And so we became one of the primary service providers in Las Vegas for child refugees. We now employ the only lawyer who works full time, providing free services to people detained by immigration. And we've received, and we're starting to implement $1 million to be spent over the next 2 years from the state of Nevada and Clark County to build the first standalone immigrant defense center, which we call the Community Advocacy Office. We're part of the Immigration Clinic, but off campus, downtown, in the Arts District, actually. So we finally know where the office is going to be, and to provide and expand our services that we can give, the legal defense that we can give to unaccompanied kids and people detained by immigration. And those are the two areas we're going to focus on. What makes us unique among that we're not the only people who provide free legal services to immigrants, but what makes us unique in Nevada is our focus on deportation defense. So I usually tell people, you do not want to have us as a lawyer, right? We are like, in medical terms, you can analogize us to the ICU. And I would prefer people get vaccines. So we can talk about that later, actually, if Congress passes something that might function like a vaccine. But right now, we do a really intensive defense for people who have their backs up against the wall. I do want to note also, always when I speak to a campus audience, that there's a third part. So those two things, two deportation defense categories: unaccompanied children and people detained by ICE. There's a third category, which is really relevant, that's a bit different. We call that university legal services. We offer this to students staff and their family members at UNLV and at the College of Southern Nevada. So we are actually in between staff members right now, but we're about to finalize hiring of our third University Legal Services Fellow. So this is a staff attorney who provides immigration assistance mostly to students. And those cases are typically not deportation cases, thank God. It has happened, unfortunately. We hate to see somebody coming from our campus communities going through deportation in their family. Most of these, I like to think of them as happy cases because they're people getting married, they're people trying to bring their families together. But we struggle, and our clients are struggling with the bureaucracy of the immigration system, how slow it is. And it just gets slower and more illogical every day. And of course, the turmoil of the DACA program, which I know we may talk about, and the instability that people with DACA have had to live with. And also, I want to note that now the gaps in DACA are really important. People entering college now are likely not to be able to get DACA. So we're back to the way things were before 2012, when undocumented students did go to college with a great deal of effort, but without the benefits of DACA, such as they are.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a lot for us to unpack there for probably a several series, conversation that because doubt that we'll be able to get to all of that in the time that we have. But certainly I have a lot of questions now that I'd like to see if we can unpack. Amy, anxious to hear about your research. Very, very anxious to hear about your research on your recent book, Socially Undocumented.
Yes, thank you so much, Harriet, for the invitation. I'm very honored to be on this distinguished panel, and I'm very excited to engage in this dialogue with my fellow participants. So I'm a philosopher, as Harriet mentioned. One of my main areas of research is in political philosophy with a particular focus on immigration questions. Why should a philosopher be present in these kinds of conversations that are about kind of people's lives and social injustices? There are a couple of reasons, well, at least among many that I'll outline now. One is that within the political philosophy of immigration, we've carved out a space to ask some big abstract questions about immigration justice that are interesting in and of themselves, but I think they have a role to play in these kinds of productive conversations about how to make people's lives better. So one of the big questions that has motivated philosophy of immigration is that of whether borders are in fact just. Right? It's a huge abstract question, but philosophy invites us to take a step back and say, well, can just governments even have coercive borders to begin with, right? If we assume, as we ought to, that we're all moral equals, is it okay that there are some states, that most states are in fact making it difficult for would-be members to join the political community, right? It thwarts people's life prospects in different ways. It's frustrating. It can even send messages about the supposed inferiority of people from certain nations. So that's the open borders debate in political philosophy. And that might seem kind of terribly abstract, but as the philosopher of immigration, Joseph Cairns, has said, we need to create space to talk about what kind of true justice looks like if we're to have a good sense of the direction in which we should be going in terms of our activism, right? So should we be campaigning against borders or not? On the other hand, even within philosophy, we also try to carve out space for conversations about immigration justice that are very attentive to the way in which the world works, right? So a good example of this is in the realm of undocumented migration, right? What does justice for undocumented migrants look like? Well, if you want to have that kind of conversation, you can't really assume a world without borders, even if you think that would be a better world, because in an open borders world, undocumented migration, as we know of it today, wouldn't exist, right? So how do you have, so the kind of overarching methodological question is, how do you have a good conversation about immigration ethics that's also reflective of the messiness of the world, right? So how far can we push ourselves? What sorts of ethical theories should we be calling upon? And so philosophers are both attentive to these kinds of moral questions, but we're also having a broader conversation about how we should even pursue our dialogues about immigration justice. So of course, I have so much more to say about that, but I don't want to go off on too much of a philosophical tangent. I'll say that my own research in my book, Socially Undocumented Identity and Immigration Justice, it's kind of a combination of these utopian approaches, but also kind of real world approaches to thinking about immigration justice. I'm interested in the ways in which so-called immigrant illegality, which I call socially undocumented identity, because the term illegal as applied to people is a racial slur. But I focus on the ways in which it operates as a social identity that sometimes tracks legal status, but doesn't always track legal status. So some people who, in fact, have a right to be present legally in the United States are nevertheless treated as so-called illegals, right, in various contexts. But at the same time, there are some people who are present in the US without legal permission who are not treated this way. And so part of the task of my book is to understand this history of designating certain bodies and people as so-called illegals or as so-called or socially undocumented people. Where did this come from? And what does this broaden understanding of socially undocumented identity? What does that tell us about what we should be pursuing for immigration justice?
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, okay. In my mind, I keep going back to this 1987 proclamation, right? And that proclamation sounded very utopian to me. Now, I am young enough to remember 1987, right? And to know that even then there remained issues, concerns, whatever the word that we want to say about immigration, and the resounding thing about needing universal immigration reform. Okay. So I hear that. I know that tomorrow we're still celebrating this day of Immigration Day. But as I said, what's going on in our country and at our borders today just seems so very different than what this proclamation in 87 said, right? Or even how we in many ways fantasize, if you will, how immigrants, particularly those who came through Ellis Island. We know that others of us, ancestors did not come that way, and those experiences are very different. But I guess my question is how do we, why do we have these so very different things colliding and coming up against each other when we're talking about immigration? And bottom line is that we're talking about people. I mean, it's not that we're talking about people. So I guess I kind of like your take on that. Why this justification, position that we're experiencing now and witnessing. Whoever wants to take that one first is fine.
I have thoughts, but all right, I'll go ahead, and then feel free to shut me up because my mother says I talk too much.
Oh.
So, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. Actually, I think it's in a way an interesting person to start with, because his administration was actually filled with contradictions, as many are on immigration policy. But he was known as a conservative. I'm from a very progressive family, so I was raised to hate Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. But it turns out now that I work on immigration policy, I have admiration for him in certain ways, although I want to note there are many. He passed from the 1987, he was fresh off of signing the 1986 bill, which was our last major amnesty and last major comprehensive immigration reform. Although actually Bill Clinton enacted a pretty comprehensive immigration reform that was incredibly harsh. Bill Clinton really handed Donald Trump a lot of the tools that he used. So Ronald Reagan, now to be clear, to give a full picture, he was not really an open borders president, but he he actually, a lot of the origin of our harsh treatment of Haitian migrants, which we've recently seen pretty disturbing images of, much of that can be traced directly back to Ronald Reagan. So to be really clear, but as long as we're talking about proclamations, I actually keep on my phone. I think one of the most beautiful speeches given about America's attitude towards immigrants, the one that I think my parents wanted to pass down to me, was articulated by Ronald Reagan in his farewell address in 1989. If you'll give me permission to read this.
Sure.
I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it and see it still. So I don't think his own policies fully lived up to that vision, but it's a vision I would certainly share. But let me point out some other things. He was, of course, seen as a conservative Republican president, right? But we have to keep in mind at this time, this is the shifting. There's been massive shifting of policy in politics on immigration. At that time, you could not easily say that one party was pro-immigrant, one party was anti-immigrant. It was an issue that very much split both parties. Excuse me. And there were people on the left who very much were skeptical, people in the civil rights movement, African American leaders who were often very skeptical of immigration, who saw it as a threat to undermine working class people, and then as a pro-business policy to get cheap labor. So today things have really shifted, so that you really can say between our two major parties that one is more pro-immigrant and one is quite anti-immigrant. I think the Republican Party, which takes the anti-immigrant position, is actually more coherent at this point. Not in a good way, but I do think it's fairly coherent. And I think though Professor Reed Sandoval, I think, really articulated some of the tensions here, right? That about as I think that many people in the U.S. have actually become more able to accept people who are undocumented as our neighbors who should be accepted and welcomed. This is their home. That's really a pretty mainstream idea now. Unfortunately, not consensus, but it's pretty mainstream in public opinion polling, and at least easily endorsed by one of our major parties. And yet, as we can see, say recently with the Haitians at the border, even that party hardly wants the doors open at the border. And so the questions that Professor Reed Sandoval asked, I think, really hit the anxieties of our time. I think that as time has moved on, this is partly as a result, frankly, of academic research, but also in politics, the idea that there are sort of sound policy reasons why we might not want immigrants have kind of faded away, to be honest. The economic research is really pretty clear that immigration is almost always helpful. Can there sometimes be people whose marginal wages go down really slightly if you squint? Maybe, but barely, and only in certain studies even find that. There's really a pretty large consensus that by any sort of objective policy basis, it's good to have more migration. It's also human. We're really evolved to do it. That's very much my philosophy. We are built to be, because we have large, powerful brains, we are built to be adaptable. Most species on this planet cannot easily move from one climate zone to another and figure out how to survive there, but we can, and we always have for thousands of years. And when things get difficult or we see something better somewhere else, it's one of the great things about humans. I really honestly think that to prohibit people from migrating is about as effective as telling them not to fall in love and have sex. It's pretty much results in cruelty and some similar and frankly violence in some similar ways. But I think as our politics has evolved, I think what we can see a lot more clearly now than say when I went to law school is that the reasons people resist immigration are not driven by what we might see as legitimate concerns for the most part. They're fears of the other. They're fears of other cultures. Some people have a viscerally negative reaction to hearing a different language spoken next to them, even if they're not in the conversation. And
That's true.
I think, it's worth asking, I guess I defer to the philosopher here, on whether there are any legitimate reasons to that beyond mere intolerance and hatred and white supremacy. Um, that's something from my much more amateurish understanding, I know there is some debate about whether people have some kind of right to want to live in a political community of only people like themselves. But I would say, at least the values I was raised with, when my parents told me about, the romantic vision of this country that my parents told me about, was that no, actually, we don't have the right to say that I only want to live with people like myself. In fact, what makes this place wonderful is that we live with people who are different and are open to other people who are different. Sorry, like I said, my mom said I talk a lot.
No, wonderful, wonderful. You brought up a lot of points to ponder. One of which that you talked about, that you know humans desire, right, to go other places, to migrate elsewhere, is something that is innate. It is something that we do, and I never really thought about that before. And I think that that's probably very, very true, and very, very correct. Amy, what about, are there any particular reasons, right, that are legitimate for folks to have about not wanting people to immigrate, anything?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that question. Yes, we're definitely in kind of political philosophy territory here. I think it depends on one's kind of guiding political philosophy. Often when we think about kind of borders and open borders, there's so much reference to the US-Mexico border and all of the violence and injustice that occurs there, right? And so I think that if that's kind of our reference point, all kind of policies of immigrant exclusion do seem unjust. Sometimes if you kind of play with the example a bit, it's a terrible way of saying it, but for example, if we think about rights of indigenous communities, of Native American communities, to have some social cohesion and not allow kind of any prospective outsider to join the political community, often in that case, people's intuitions will change a little bit and say, well, yes, I can see why a Native American community should not allow just kind of any outsider, right, to gain full membership, right? Because opening borders in philosophy, it's not just about opening the border, it's about creating meaningful pathways for full membership in a political community. I know, for example, and there are lots of, and here's the problematic language, so-called United Statesian expats, right, who are not referred to as immigrants, right? They're called expats, which is problematic. But living in Mexico, there are many openly kind of Trump supporting communities, right, in Mexico that are kind of quite anti-immigrant. I think that might raise some kind of immigration justice questions about whether kind of that sort of migration should be permitted or tolerated, or it raises a different set of philosophical questions. So I do think that we should be careful in kind of espousing open borders without reflecting on kind of what we're referring to. But I do agree with Professor Kagan that so much intolerance towards immigrants is it comes from white supremacy. I know that Harriet, you had encouraged us to think a little bit about kind of the history behind this. And I wanted to quote the late philosopher Charles Mills, a philosopher of race who recently passed away. And he wrote this really important book, The Racial Contract, saying, white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the world what it is today. And he goes on to describe how we have this racial contract in which we have a nation that's founded upon conquest, colonization, and enslavement. And so I think that if we kind of read kind of the development of anti-immigrationism against this backdrop of white supremacy, that it's been kind of so strongly enforced in the United States since the nation's founding, I think that a lot of these attitudes become clear. It becomes clearer to put them into perspective. So I hope Mike, that answers your question. But I love this kind of political philosophy spirit we're embracing in the panel.
And I just want to apologize that the way I set that up, you ended up having to do the explanation of white supremacy. So I apologize for trapping you that way.
I mean, as I was saying, it's very clear that we could probably talk a long, long time and often about this. this is an aspect of something that the intersection is involved in now with the addition of Nayeli that certainly I am trying to learn more about as we, look at how we're providing and delivering programs and services, particularly for students who are undocumented. And I mean, we all have our personal feelings or philosophies about whatever, but it becomes very important for me to gain additional information. And so I'm hearing a lot of different things that I'm certainly going to be milling over in my mind. But as both of you all were talking, and considering the fact that we are on a university campus, and obviously UNLV has taken the steps to say that issues related to immigration, you know, are important, and then certainly that our students who are undocumented, are also important. I'd like to hear from Nayeli, who this has impacted her in a number of different ways, and now is also impacting her from a professional standpoint, because this is now her job, right? So I'd like to get your take, Nayeli, on some of the things that both Michael and Amy have said, and if you wouldn't mind, if you feel comfortable with that, even personalizing those things, from being both a student and a professional who's undocumented and a DACA recipient.
Yeah, I'd love to share. So I think that so growing up as someone who is undocumented, and fearing, police, fearing that my parents wouldn't be home when I would get home from school, it was a very stressful childhood that I had, and I feel like not a lot of students could relate to me. Maybe they could, and I just didn't know that they were also undocumented, but it was a very isolating time, growing up like that. And so when one tries to open up about that, when it gets closer to figuring out what's after high school, can I go to college? Can I access financial aid? Like what programs can I take part of? If I need health insurance, like how can I access that? Or how can my family find other sorts of resources to be able to survive? Like these were all questions that had to be tailored according to immigration status. And so it was a very trying time in trying to navigate that. And um I think that it can also be emotionally tolling for someone to constantly have to open up about their status. And so it's important to have these sort of support systems. And so that's why I'm super happy to be within this role today. And I'm very happy that UNLV has taken the initiative of even having it in the first place, because that's a really big step in getting this accessibility for our students. And so I think the more we're open about, as an institution, or even as a system of higher education, being open about supporting our undocumented student population, supporting immigrants, it allows for these students to not have to go through such maybe difficult situations where they have to talk about their status. They may feel a little more they might be a little less hesitant to share their status if they know that their institution backs them up, in terms of providing support. So yeah, I hope that that answers the question a little bit, and provides a little bit of just background on what it is to be an undocumented student, because there's a lot to it. And I'm just happy that we're starting to have these initiatives, and we can only grow them and expand upon them as we go now.
Thank you. So I'd like to kind of keep that going a little bit from a standpoint of what happens in the classroom, right? So Amy, I would not have thought that you would have this particular research interest in philosophy, right? So you say philosophy to me, and I'm thinking, what Plato, Socrates, so on and so forth, right? So obviously, this is your passion, right? And so, how do you incorporate this into your actual content curriculum? you know, because I'm sure that when a student is getting ready to take your first level philosophy class, that they're not expecting for it potentially to go into this direction. So how do you navigate that?
Yes, thank you. I'm fortunate to sometimes be able to teach a course specifically on immigration and political philosophy. So for those who are interested, we just kind of dig into these questions. But you're right. Philosophy is traditionally kind of associated with kind of utopian kinds of conversations that are disconnected from the real world. And I'd like to say that I try to kind of work against that vision. Of course, we do have lots of abstract conversations, but even, if you go back to kind of the days of Socrates and Plato, you see a lot of engaged philosophy happening. Philosophy involves challenging the status quo in your community and asking these critical questions, right? And so I think that that philosophical training can be really empowering for students and for everyone, right? To feel, again, empowered to ask these questions, to wonder, to actively wonder about whether things like kind of mainstream immigration policies and legislations are in fact just, right? And so I try to connect kind of the work that we do as philosophers in terms of abstract theorizing to the kind of spirit that we need to be engaged public citizens that are concerned about social injustice. So that's kind of, in terms of so upper level classes, we have space to really just focus in on these issues. But I even think even in an intro to philosophy class, you can gain skills, some of the skills that you need to be an ally to undocumented students, to undocumented people, and even I think to stand up for oneself as a member of an oppressed or marginalized group.
Sure. I mean, I think that is so true. I mean, because oftentimes we have our thoughts, our feelings, our philosophies based on just pure fiction, right? Or myth, right? And I guess, it's saying now is like I read it on Facebook, right? So therefore, once you say I read it on Facebook, you know that it probably ain't true, right? You know what I mean? And so, how we are informed, in many ways is lacking, I think. But more importantly, it's folks reluctant to actually learn the truth, or I always say here is help me understand. Because I really am trying to understand why somebody feels or thinks a particular way, because that may you know change me, or at least I get to a level of understanding of that person, rather than having some kind of negative connotation about the individuals. But that's kind of the way that things are, unfortunately. Michael, you were talking about the kinds of cases that you see, obviously, in the immigration clinic. Have your numbers increased in terms of people seeking services, or is there reluctance for folks to seek your services?
Oh, there's plenty of demand. We're sort of constantly overwhelmed, and then as we open up more services, there's a lot of word of mouth. So sometimes when we are overwhelmed or have less capacity, word gets around, oh, they're not taking people anymore. We'll get fewer calls, and then as soon as we open up more capacity, then we'll get way more calls than we can handle, even with expanded capacity. It does change. We're defense attorneys, especially when we're dealing with deportation. So I would prefer a world where we were not needed at all, and we could close down. So we did. Our work is determined a little bit by who the government tries to deport. So that has shifted somewhat, not as much as I'd like, but somewhat from change of administration. But for what it's worth, like right now, we're getting more inquiries from unaccompanied children than we are from detained adults. That's good in a way. The detention population is about half, even less than half than it was in the first half of 2019 nationally. So, more towards the kids, but I don't want kids to be in deportation proceedings either.
Sure. Do you also see individuals who are in what and pardon if I get the categories wrong, like refugee status or asylum seekers, do you also see?
A lot of our cases are asylum seekers and are refugees. Actually, almost all of the kids that we represent are refugees. Even though if there's debate about the legal boundaries of that term, they have all fled violence in their life. Violence and fear are the main drivers for why they're here. We don't, because we focus on deportation defense, we don't tend to do a lot of what we call affirmative asylum applications, which is when people who are not facing deportation still apply for asylum. We have done that, some for students. So we've helped some UNLV students apply for asylum. But that's probably not the majority of our cases. We are doing, I'm actually excited to say, we are going to be trying next semester. Our students will be focusing, we think, a lot to be worked out, on Afghan refugees. And this is kind of an exceptional program that goes a little bit outside of our model, but I think we all saw the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan and the number of desperate people. 150 people at least, Afghan refugees, are going to be resettled to Nevada, but they're being resettled with an unstable legal status. So they're going to need, unlike other resettled refugees, they actually have greater legal needs. So we're going to be working with private lawyers, Legal Aid Center of Southern Nevada, and our students. Hopefully, everyone will hopefully take some cases.
Sure. I know several years ago when I was doing my listening tour that helped to establish the intersection, I was talking with an academic advisor in a very specific college. Won't mention that college, but one of the things that advisor was telling me about were the number, and in that advisor's mind, that the number was significant, even if it was like 3 or 4 or 5 students who were either in the refugee status and or asylum status, and how they were trying to help those students navigate all of that, right? As well as obviously, you're trying to navigate where and how you're living, and then also being a student, and then what that means. So yeah, that's something I always remembered, and this whole area, because there are so many students that we're going to be working with and have worked with over the course, of time, that are undocumented for whatever reasons, right? We'll see students whose visas have run out, right? And then as a result, end up getting deported or getting close to deported, and getting picked up and things of that nature, which is heartbreaking, and it is something that you want to be able to do something about, obviously. And sometimes, our hands feel like that they are at least tied, because these are students who look at UNLV as home. That this is their home, and as a result, they want to feel like that there is some protection there. So I appreciate it. Well, we're winding down on time, and so before we say thank yous and all of that for participating, just want to know if you've got any closing thoughts that you'd like to impart at this point. Here, maybe we'll do this. What are 3 things that you wish that you could change with respect to this system that would make everything better? Hey, Ellie, we'll start with you. Your top 3. Yeah.
Oh man, that's tough. Top three things I'd like to, if they could change. I would say, ooh, um, let's see, maybe like financial aid assistance for documented students can be very limited in terms of funding during both undergraduate and graduate schools. Let's see what else. Accessing public services. Sometimes that social security number is required for individuals to access public services or public resources. So I think that would be very important. And then lastly, career options, expansion of career options, because we have students a lot of times looking at a specific career and then end up being told that they can't proceed with going through with going through that career route because it maybe certification is requires that social security number and they're not able to provide that, so therefore they aren't able to access that specific career. So we're still trying to navigate that as well for our undocumented student population. But yeah, I think those are, I'm sure I can come up with more.
Amy, your top three.
Yes, I started kind of rapidly scrolling down my wish list, and now I'm having trouble like trying to rank them, right? Because they're all so important. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. It's wonderful, to be appearing with folks who do such important kind of social outreach and activism, and it's been wonderful. In my book, I talk a lot about the importance of demilitarizing the U.S.-Mexico border because of the strong kind of role it plays in the perpetuation of what I call socially undocumented identity. I also think that we need to halt deportations, and I argue that you don't have to be an open borders advocate to arrive at that position. Deportations under current circumstances just cannot be conducted justly in this country. And this is where I have the ranking problem. I think it's very important that we be attentive to the language that we use to talk about immigrants. Part of that also kind of changing our language practices involves careful listening to immigrants and to socially undocumented people who have lots of wisdom and ideas for how we should pursue the activism that is needed. So I do have more on my special wish list here, but I'll leave it with those three notes because I'm also eager to hear what Mike would wish for.
Thanks.
Well, a bit off. I just want to say, first of all, that in terms of daily work and to be more pragmatic, Nayeli's list is great. But I think for the purpose of conversation, I'll be more like Amy with some more pie in the sky hopes. I would like this is probably very along the same lines. To have an immigration policy that starts from the premise migration is good. We want to be the country that people want to immigrate to. And I actually heard Joe Biden, for what it's worth, when he's on the campaign trail, had some nice moments that I thought were in the spirit, where he would talk to someone who, say, recently had become a U.S. citizen, and he would, instead of saying congratulations to the person, he would say, thank you for choosing us. And I thought that's beautiful. I wish that the policy of his administration is more in that spirit. And I think from that, I don't know if that leads actually to total open borders either. I think actually that's the term. I think it might lead to, again, a pro-migration. You can have regulated migration, but that's legal and safe and available and understood that the same way that we have regulated housing. We understand housing is good. We regulate it. You don't want a complete chaotic situation, but I wish migration were more like that. And in short of that, I guess, again, but still a major change in American law, since I'm a law professor, American law, starting from the Supreme Court, for more than 100 years, has treated deportation as a casual thing, as just an administrative thing, as if it was just sort of like the IRS saying that you calculated your taxes wrong. That's largely how they've treated it. And if we're not going to have a change in, who can come legally at a more fundamental level, at least I would like our legal system to recognize how grave it is to inflict government power on someone, to forcibly take them out of the place they want to be in, say, no, we're pushing you out now, and to attach safeguards, constitutional protections, due process protections, rights of independent review that we really don't have now to that to be appropriate. And then, that's only two, but those are big enough. I'm going to stop with those two, and then I'll just adopt Nayeli's lesson.
Well, I appreciate your top three, all of you. So that gives us 9 things, right? To continue to look for and work toward. I mean, because even though they may be dreams, or wishes, that's where change starts. I have to believe that. And I have to believe that at some point in time that we get to this point of of looking when an immigrant, comes in, and we say thank you for choosing us for all of the right reasons, and that folks who are coming and wanting to come to this country, that they are all treated the same, regardless of race, creed, color, and so on and so forth. Um, because I do think that, obviously the story and the history of immigrants in this country, and the contributions in particular of immigrants in this country is something that we can celebrate, regardless of how those immigrants got here, regardless of how any of us got to this country. There are important contributions and acknowledgments that our ancestors, whatever you want to call, made to this country and make it what it is. And I think that those are the things that should be celebrated. And at least I am going to go into tomorrow, obviously standing with immigrants, because that is a very, there, we are all important, and immigrants are important. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for participating in this particular panel discussion. It ended just like I expected to be, informative and helping me a lot. And I just want to say thank you to all. So thank you, Nayeli. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Michael, for joining us for our 3 for 3 virtual pop-up fair on I Stand with Immigrants. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I ended. Thank